What happens when the deadliest threat in a city can't be seen, smelled, or heard? In Pripyat, the morning of April 26 began like any other. Shops opened, a wedding was planned, and a children's parade rehearsed for May Day. Life continued, because nothing looked wrong. But inside the turbine hall at Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, firefighters were already collapsing from an invisible force no one was prepared to name. Confusion spread faster than information. Alarms sounded, reports were softened, and authority hesitated. The question was no longer what had happened, but who understood it and when. This documentary reconstructs the first day of the disaster, from the earliest blast reports to the delayed evacuation order. We'll examine how routine announcements, rigid protocols, and institutional silence masked a rapidly escalating emergency, and how an ordinary city continued its day while radiation quietly rewrote its fate. Understanding those first hours is essential to understanding Chernobyl itself. The catastrophe was not only a technological failure, but an information failure, one shaped by assumptions, procedures, and decisions made under pressure, long before the danger could be seen. The morning of April 27th looked ordinary around the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Smoke drifted from the shattered core of reactor number 4, but from a distance, the site seemed intact. Inside the ruined structure, heat and fission products continued to drive radioactive steam upward, lifting particles into the air. Plant workers reported for shifts, traffic moved along the access roads, and loudspeakers repeated routine announcements. The ground did not shake, windows did not rattle, and the air felt still. Yet the reactor's remains were venting material that had no color and no smell, spreading far beyond the fences before anyone grasped the scale. In the control buildings, surviving engineers tried to piece together what the night's explosions had done. Panels were smashed, indicators were dark or frozen, and the instruments that did work gave conflicting readings. Handheld dosimeters, designed for lower ranges, pegged to their maximum and held there, a false ceiling that suggested manageable levels. More robust meters were scarce, and some teams shared them in turns. Without trustworthy numbers, supervisors argued over whether the core was intact, whether the roof was on fire, or whether the graphite moderator could even burn. The plant's emergency procedures assumed known hazards. They did not map onto a reactor with its core open to the sky. Just a few kilometers away, Pripyat moved on schedule. Children got ready for school, buses arrived at stops, and shops raised their shutters. The weather was clear, so many people chose to walk. Radiation in the streets rose steadily, especially along grassy strips and near puddles where particles settled. Workers' clothing carried contamination home. Ash-like debris landed on balconies and window ledges, and some residents brushed it away without concern. A faint metallic taste and sore throats were common, but few linked those sensations to radiation. With no sirens and no warnings, habit won. By late morning, helicopters began circling the plant to assess damage. Pilots flew passes over the main buildings and the broken reactor hall, banking through hot plumes they could not see. Many had no respiratory protection beyond standard flight masks. Crews reported headaches and nausea after short sorties. Some flights dropped materials in an effort to stifle fires and limit releases, but the understanding of the source term and airflow was incomplete. Exposure built quickly in the air, where dose rates spiked near the plume. As sunlight strengthened, a strange blue glow was reported near the destroyed unit. That light traced to ionized air under intense radiation fields, a rare phenomenon outside accident scenes and high-energy experiments. It was a signal of the field's strength, not a guide for safe distance. Cameras brought close to the site produced fogged frames and streaks, another sign that the air itself had become active enough to defeat film. By midday, the first external alarms came not from Soviet monitors, but from Sweden. Workers at the Forsmark nuclear plant triggered radiation detectors as they passed through exit controls, forcing a check of the plant. Then, the wind. European networks began trading data, while within the USSR, officials still hunted for reliable readings. The morning after the blast locked in a pattern. Normal routines hid danger, instruments misled decision-makers, and distance offered less protection than time. In that gap, hour by hour, exposure climbed as if the day were any other. Pripyat grew in the 1970s as a showcase for the nuclear future. Planners carved wide boulevards between standardized apartment blocks, set schools within walking distance, and built a modern hospital complex to serve young families. The city center had a cultural palace, a swimming pool, and a riverside promenade. Shops stocked well for a closed city, and utilities ran on a reliable schedule. Just beyond the plaza, an amusement park stood nearly complete for May Day. Bumper cars lined up, swings ready, and a bright yellow Ferris wheel waiting for its first riders. The average age in Pripyat hovered in the mid-20s, and the calendar promised spring parades, work awards, and a long weekend. As the morning unfolded, life kept its rhythm while radiation threaded through alleys and courtyards. Fishermen cast lines along the Pripyat River, finding quiet eddies below the bridge. Children played football on dusty fields and chased each other under blooming trees that trapped fine particles on petals and leaves. Couples posed for wedding photos, the white dress and dark suit pressed against new grass, and guests gathered for simple banquets in apartment kitchens. Buses ran in neat intervals, and the day's errands took people past kindergartens, a cinema showing weekend matinees, and kiosks selling ice cream. None of these acts carried a warning light or a sound. The threat moved with the wind, settled in low spots, and clung to surfaces. From balconies on the higher floors, a few residents noted a metallic taste that felt out of place and a faint haze toward the plant. Some pointed out a bluish sheen above the damaged unit early in the day, while others simply watched helicopter arcs and assumed a standard industrial fire. Official channels offered little. Local radio stayed with scheduled programming, and workplace briefings focused on routine. Without clear instruction to shelter or leave, people trusted habit and proximity to authority, and rumors bounced between stairwells and courtyards without resolution. Inside the city administration, information lagged behind events. Phone calls from the plant arrived fractured and cautious, and the language downplayed risk. The devices on hand to sample air and surfaces had ranges too low to show the actual intensity, and many readings looked deceptively ordinary. Staff debated practical steps, keeping children indoors, closing parks, but lacked authority to announce more than brief advisories. In the meantime, maintenance crews took hoses to the streets to tidy dust and ash. Water pinned contaminated particles into pavement seams and soil beds, making them harder to lift later and ensuring they stayed where feet and bicycle tires would pass. By afternoon, the amusement park stood quiet. The Ferris wheel never turned with passengers, its paint already catching dust that would mark it for decades. Across the river, apartment blocks warmed in the sun, while laundry lines filled with shirts and sheets that picked up the day's fallout. The hospital continued normal outpatient hours, and shops sold bread and milk until closing. People spoke about a short disruption, maybe a day or two, and many packed small bags in case of a temporary relocation. The scale remained out of reach. By evening, measurements taken outside the city showed contamination that placed Pripyat among the most effective urban areas on record. Yet the streets did not empty. Families locked doors, set alarms, and left windows cracked for the cool night air, expecting to return to the week they had planned. Beyond the wrecked reactor, the main hazard did not shout. Radiation moved without color or scent, crossing streets, washing into drains, and drifting through open windows. It traveled in air currents that shifted by the hour, and it dissolved into water that ran on roofs and pooled in courtyards. People trusted their senses, and their senses offered nothing unusual. The threat passed through the city's quiet routines, threading into lungs and settling on skin, while the fire's smoke drew attention away from what carried most of the dose. Gamma rays carried energy deep into the body, while particles added a second route of harm. Fine aerosols and dust landed on food, hands, and clothes, then found their way into mouths and noses. A jacket hung on a balcony rail could pick up contamination, and wearing it might bring the source within centimeters of the thyroid and marrow. Concrete walls and fabric offered little protection against the most penetrating radiation, and distance that looked safe by eye had no relation to dose. Two neighbors could stand within a few steps of each other and leave with different exposures, depending on wind eddies, how long they talked, and whether they stood on asphalt or grass. The biology made the danger easier to miss. Cells damaged by radiation did not send pain signals. DNA breaks, immune suppression, and damage to the lining of the gut unfolded invisibly at first. Many people felt normal for hours or days, even when the dose was high enough to cause later organ failure. That delay kept families outdoors, kept errands going, and kept windows open for fresh air. In workplaces, the absence of immediate distress reinforced the idea that the situation was under control, even while cumulative dose mounted with every minute spent in a plume or hotspot. Early symptoms, when they appeared, looked like common strain. Dizziness, headaches, and fatigue matched the stress of a sleepless night, the smell of smoke, or a skipped meal. Without context, clinicians and supervisors could not distinguish ordinary exhaustion from the onset of acute radiation syndrome. Time to symptom became a crucial clue, but in the city and nearby villages, that clock often ran in the background while people kept moving. Contamination did not spread evenly. Particles fell in patches, trapped by hedges, caught in puddles, or funneled by building corners. A child stepping from a curb onto a strip of grass might spike their exposure for a few minutes, then return to a lower field on the sidewalk. Playgrounds, bus stops, and shaded courtyards collected deposits that standard street cleaning could not remove. Washing some surfaces made matters worse by fixing particles into cracks and soil where they remained within daily reach. Some reported brief, strange sensations that later stood out, a metallic taste that did not match any food, or faint flashes with their eyes closed. Those experiences traced to radiation interacting with nerves and the visual system. They did not last long, and they were easy to explain away at the time. The larger pattern, though, was silence. An unseen dose field shaped choices, delayed warnings, and kept attention on fires and smoke instead of the plume. That quiet misled decision-makers and residents alike, and by the time measurements caught up, exposure patterns were already set for the day ahead. They rolled out within minutes, sirens cutting through the night, convinced they were heading to an industrial fire. Orders sounded routine: roof fires, bitumen burning, debris to clear. Crews from Pripyat and the plant brigade climbed aboard with standard gear: turnout coats, rubber boots, felt helmets, and basic respirators designed for smoke and heat. No one briefed them on radiation. No dosimeters were issued on the trucks, and no one paused to test the air. The protocol for a blaze was clear. The hazard they faced did not fit that playbook. The scene at the plant was lit in uneven layers, orange from the scattered fires and a cold glow near the shattered unit. Teams split across rooftops and stairwells to knock back flames that crawled along tar and roofing layers. Ladders scraped concrete, hoses snaked across walkways hot enough to soften soles. Water arced into the darkness, and steam lifted off panels and pipes. They worked fast, because that is how you beat a rooftop fire: isolate, smother, move on. No one told them that every minute spent above the reactor buildings stacked dose faster than heat could blister. On catwalks and rubble piles, firefighters kicked aside black blocks and tossed smaller pieces by hand to open paths for hose teams. The chunks looked like dense, charred stone. They were graphite from the reactor core, still radiating at levels that could deliver lethal exposure in seconds. Gloves meant for abrasion did nothing against gamma radiation. Men who handled those pieces felt normal in the moment, then developed nausea on the stairs, then staggered and returned to the lines because the flames still needed crews. Protective clothing helped them breathe through smoke and kept sparks from burning skin, but radiation bypassed those defenses. Standard masks filtered soot, not radionuclides. Fine particles rose into lungs and settled there, while external fields pierced layers of fabric and leather. The hottest zones sat where they needed to stand, near parapets, along ventilation shafts, and beside the shattered walls of the turbine hall. Supervisors tried to rotate positions like they would in a chemical fire, but there were no readings to define safe intervals, and the most dangerous spots did not look any different. One of the best-known responders, Vasily Ignatenko, kept working through waves of weakness, helping raise ladders and guide hoses, even as teammates reported dizziness and a bitter taste. Others described an immediate heat that did not feel like flame, and a deep fatigue that arrived out of step with the effort. Within hours, some men showed reddened skin across the face and hands where gear ran thin, a reaction closer to a burn from intense radiation than to a contact injury. Vomiting began for several on site, and more on the ride back, but crews pressed until the last obvious flames went down near dawn. When the sun came up, the roofs looked quieter and the water lines finally slackened. The main fires were out. The radiation was not. Damage done during those first hours would follow the firefighters into ambulances, into the city hospital, and on to specialized wards far from the plant, setting in motion a medical story that the night's call sheet never anticipated. By dawn on April 27th, the fires looked manageable, but the release did not slow. The question inside city offices and party committees was simple: evacuate or wait? Authority moved upward through layers, and local leaders held for a directive while contamination rose each hour. Phones connected Pripyat to regional centers, and the calls circled through cautious language that treated the event as a controllable incident. Without a signed order, no one risked clearing a city. The chain of command rewarded restraint, not initiative, and the result was time lost while the plume kept moving. Across the day, the outward signals of normal life stayed in place. Buses remained lined up in depots within range, fueled and ready, but idle. Schools took attendance and then sent students home early without a public reason. Weekend concerts and sports meets disappeared from bulletin boards, and factory briefings stressed routine. Markets sold bread, milk, and fresh greens as usual, food that had sat outdoors or traveled uncovered. The city's tannoy never used the words that would empty streets. That surface calm told residents that the danger, if any, was minor and temporary. Decision rooms leaned on numbers that could not see far enough. Instruments rated for industrial safety topped out early, and many readings looked misleadingly safe. Field teams walked set routes, but patchy deposition meant a block could read low while the next yard spiked high. Reports favored the lower values and treated higher ones as anomalies. Some argued that evacuating a healthy population might cause undue panic. Others pointed to nurses noting clusters of nausea and vomiting among responders. The debate stretched while the clock set dose patterns for a city that kept moving. The order finally arrived in the afternoon of April 27th, nearly a day and a half after the explosions. By that point, families had spent long hours outdoors, windows had stayed open, and laundry had hung in courtyards where particles settled. So the instruction framed the move as brief. Loudspeakers drove slowly through districts announcing a temporary relocation and asking residents to bring documents, money, and essentials, expecting a return in a few days. That promise kept the process calm. People locked apartments with food on tables and kettles on counters, careful not to overpack or delay the line of buses. Medical countermeasures lagged behind the notice. Iodine tablets sat in regional stock, but distribution schedules slipped well past the window when they would best protect the thyroid from radioactive iodine. Pharmacies had limited guidance, and school nurses without shipments could only keep children indoors. Milk collection from local farms paused late after deliveries had already reached stores. Instructions about washing produce and covering wells arrived piecemeal, long after the heaviest early deposition had passed. When buses finally rolled into neighborhoods, they moved fast and followed a map that divided the city into pickup points. Police and volunteers checked lists, elderly residents got seats near doors, and pet owners were told to leave animals behind. The line of vehicles stretched beyond sight as groups boarded in order and filed away toward reception centers. The evacuation worked as a transport task. It arrived too late to act as a shield. The delay took an incident contained to an industrial site and turned it into a civilian exposure event. By the time the last street emptied, the medical system faced a new load that would reach far beyond Pripyat. As buses pulled away from Pripyat, columns of men moved toward the plant. They came from army units, construction trusts, mining brigades, and research institutes, grouped under a single term: liquidators. Orders framed the mission in practical steps: clear debris, seal leaks, reduce spread, and left little room for debate. Many learned details only after arrival at staging areas set up in schoolyards and depots. Issued cotton overalls, rubberized coats, and sometimes respirators, they faced zones where dose rates stripped away the idea of a normal workday. Drafted in waves, the youngest were often conscripts expecting routine service, while veterans of heavy industry brought skills the site urgently needed. Briefings ran short, and maps marked with shaded blocks stood in for precise readings. Crews rotated through jobs with clipped instructions: shovel here, load there, do not linger. The gear felt familiar, but incomplete. Thin lead aprons for some, film badges for many, and a handful of high-range dosimeters shared between teams. Commanders pressed for speed because dose accumulated whether a shovel moved or not. Tasks multiplied as engineers cataloged hazards. Bulldozers scraped contaminated topsoil into trenches lined with clay. Water reservoirs were drained or isolated to keep radionuclides from spreading downstream. Work gangs cut and rolled tar from rooftops, bagged it, and hauled it to pits. Concrete barriers rose as ad hoc windbreaks and shields. Vent shafts were capped. Every action aimed to trap particles or block pathways, but each step placed people in contact with material that could not be made safe by gloves and masks. Close to the destroyed unit, machines failed. The highest fields fogged lenses, jammed circuits, and killed remote-controlled rigs that had worked in test yards. Where robots stalled, commanders sent men. On the most exposed roofs, runners sprinted short routes to throw graphite and fuel fragments back over parapets or into designated drops. Rotations lasted seconds, counted aloud, not timed by watches that might stay behind. A misstep meant a longer pass under a field that climbed with height and angle. The job demanded simple precision under stress: scoop, step, throw, turn. The phrase biorobots spread among crews because it matched what the work required. Dose limits were posted in pocket notebooks and on plywood boards, but they managed survival across a shift, not lifetime risk. Medics tracked counts, moved people to lower zones after a few passes, and sent others to rest tents when nausea and confusion appeared. Some marked their sleeves and caps with chalk to note where they had worked and how often they had crossed certain lines. The markings doubled as prompts when memory slipped or fatigue blurred orientation. Support units tried to keep exposure predictable. Field kitchens served meals in clean tents, and decontamination points hosed boots and washed tools between cycles. Laundry crews ran hot water and detergent through clothing that could be reused, while highly contaminated items went to burial with soil and brush. Medical teams took blood counts, logged symptoms, and tagged workers for follow-up. Buses rotated manpower from staging centers to the site on fixed schedules, but weather shifts and hotspots could overturn planning in an hour. By the operation's end, hundreds of thousands had rotated through. The site stood more stable, the release pathways narrower. The people who made that possible carried the cost into clinics, paperwork, and years ahead. Ambulances and plant buses ferried the first wave of injured to nearby clinics that were not equipped for radiation injuries. Staff cleaned wounds, cooled skin, and treated smoke exposure, then watched symptoms mismatch their expectations. From there, patients moved again, first to Kyiv, then farther to specialized centers, on flights and trains arranged faster than the diagnostic picture could form. The transfers were urgent, but triage relied on visible signs rather than dose history, which few could provide with confidence. Nurses clipped badges from uniforms and bagged clothing that set off improvised detectors. Each move carried contamination risk into corridors and waiting rooms. In Kyiv's hospitals, doctors began with protocols for thermal burns and inhalation damage. Fluids, pain control, antibiotics, and oxygen were standard. Many patients looked stable in their first hours, then declined sharply. Lab results caught the shift: falling lymphocyte counts, later pancytopenia, and signs of gastrointestinal injury without extensive surface burns. Infection control became central as immune defenses crashed. Some patients developed fevers without obvious sources, and chest imaging showed changes that did not match smoke inhalation alone. Teams adjusted on the fly, but they faced a cascade of organ dysfunction with few external markers to guide the pace. Transfers to Moscow concentrated the most severe cases. Hospital number 6 served as the hub for acute radiation syndrome, drawing specialists in hematology, burn care, and infectious disease into joint rounds. Admission teams built histories from fragments, time on site, tasks performed, and early vomiting onset, using those clues to estimate dose categories. Treatment plans stacked interventions: broad-spectrum antibiotics, antifungals, antivirals, blood and platelet transfusions, and aggressive fluid management. Negative pressure rooms and strict barrier nursing aimed to cut secondary infections that could turn a survivable dose into a fatal sequence. With limited precedent, physicians tested procedures out of sequence and across small cohorts. Bone marrow transplants were attempted for those with profound marrow failure, though donor matching, graft rejection, and infections complicated outcomes. Granulocyte transfusions and growth factors saw use where available. Surgeons debrided skin that broke down days after exposure, and ophthalmology teams documented corneal changes that appeared without chemical injury. Nutrition support shifted to parenteral routes when intestinal lining damage prevented absorption. Revealed patterns of organ injury that resembled toxin exposure but advanced faster than typical chemical burns. Protective practices inside hospitals lagged behind the evolving understanding of contamination pathways. Some caregivers received exposure from close contact with patients who still carried radionuclides on hair, skin, and personal items. Laundry teams handled linens that triggered area monitors. Decontamination stations were added near admissions, and protocols for waste isolation expanded from dressing bins to entire rooms when readings stayed elevated. Staff rotated to manage both dose and fatigue, and occupational health units tracked blood counts for caregivers who had no expectation of exposure before the incident. Patients often found themselves behind closed doors with minimal family contact. Isolation served medical goals, but it also fit a broader pattern of controlled access and limited disclosure. Relatives received brief updates and, in some cases, were told little about expected courses. Medical records circulated under restricted channels, slowing the exchange of insights between teams handling similar complications in different wards. The approach shielded institutions more than it helped decision-making at the bedside. Even with improvisation and high-intensity care, outcomes split among dose lines that medicine could not always move. Some survived after weeks of infections, transfusions, and slow marrow recovery. Others deteriorated despite maximal support. The response revealed skill and resolve, but it also showed how unprepared systems were for internal emitters and deep tissue injury that presented late. From this point on, the event no longer looked like a plant accident confined to a site. It read as a long-term health burden, tracked in lab values, follow-up scans, and the quiet routines of aftercare. While crews focused on the plant, the atmosphere turned into a conveyor belt. Heat from the destroyed core carried gases and ash upward, where strong updrafts injected radionuclides into higher air layers. Winds shifted through the day, shearing and spreading the plume into bands that crossed the border before maps could be updated. Altitude mattered. Material lofted high could travel hundreds of kilometers before gravity and weather pushed it down again. That separation in height created different arrival times, so cities along the same latitude recorded peaks hours or even days apart, confusing early trackers. The mix aloft included iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium isotopes bound to microscopic particles. Their size and chemistry shaped where they landed. Dry fallout drifted down in a slow sift, coating hard surfaces and collecting in gutters. When rain formed inside a cloud, droplets scavenged particles efficiently and dropped them in concentrated streaks, turning passing showers into invisible paint rollers that drew narrow, intense swaths across fields and towns. A farm might test high while the next village read low, not because distance offered safety, but because a rain band had chosen a path that instruments later traced in jagged lines. Belarus received some of the heaviest contamination, even though it sat north of the plant rather than closest by road. Wind fields wrapped around a blocking weather pattern and directed the plume across its agricultural heartland. Rain sealed the outcome by dragging particles into soils and onto pastures. Villages that depended on local produce faced a tougher problem. Contamination now lived in the very ground that sustained them. Mapping teams fanned out with high-range meters and soil samplers, and the resulting atlases looked less like neat circles than tangled ribbons running northeast. In northern Ukraine and parts of western Russia, the food chain became a swift route from fallout to people. Pasture grass trapped iodine and cesium on blades and in early growth. Cows ate the grass, concentrated iodine-131 in the thyroid, and excreted radionuclides into milk within days. Children, who drank more milk per body weight and had active thyroids, faced higher uptake. Instructions to switch to stored feed or discard early milk often arrived late or lacked the supplies to make the change. Dairies tested batches where they could, but uneven deposition meant a safe reading today did not guarantee tomorrow's luck. What stunned many observers was the speed with which monitors across Europe saw the signal. Stations in Scandinavia, Central Europe, and the British Isles recorded spikes in airborne radioactivity and deposition on rain collectors within days. Each network plotted its own curves, and together they drew a moving picture of the plume's reach that no single country could have produced. The pattern showed that a reactor accident, even at one site, could imprint itself on the continent's air and water systems before officials finished their first briefings. Years later, traces turned up far from the plant and long after the fires went out. Samples from Arctic ice cores and alpine snowpacks carried the isotopic fingerprints of the release, thin but clear. Those records confirmed what the early networks suggested. Lofted material had ridden storm tracks thousands of kilometers before settling into layers that preserved a timeline of the event. From this point on, containment meant more than fences and checkpoints. The fallout's path tied farm policy, health guidance, and environmental monitoring to weather charts, and it forced cooperation across borders that had not planned to share data. Across borders, radiation monitors blared. Across ministries, phones stayed guarded. Information moved through a system that treated disclosure as a risk in itself. Officials who controlled the flow weighed not only what people needed to know, but what acknowledging failure might mean for careers and the state's image. That calculation slowed every message. Early cables classified field readings and draft assessments, restricting them to narrow circles. Regional leaders received fragments, summary numbers stripped of context, curves without scales, then faced choices about schools, food, and public gatherings with only partial pictures. Internal memos softened language. Phrases like elevated and localized replaced terms that would trigger broader action. Reports circulating between plant authorities, health ministries, and party committees often shaved off worst-case scenarios, arguing that decisive steps could follow once confirmed data arrived. Confirmation depended on instruments that had already maxed out in the most affected areas, so delays fed back into the narrative of caution. The loop rewarded understatement. A governor with an alarming bulletin risked rebuke. A governor with a calm note met approval. The system produced the tone it wanted to hear. At the top, the priority was stability and international posture. Leaders feared that rapid public acknowledgement would invite scrutiny at home and abroad. Announcements lagged behind what regional laboratories and military units already knew. Only after foreign stations traced the plume back towards Soviet territory did public statements begin to expand beyond a minor incident. Until then, editors treated the story as a routine industrial mishap. The goal was to maintain order, not to map risk for residents standing under a changing sky. Broadcast schedules stayed intact. Variety shows aired on time. City committees weighed whether to cancel events that anchored the calendar. In Kyiv, the May Day parade proceeded under radiation levels that would later prompt decontamination of city streets and parks. That decision balanced optics against exposure, and optics won. The calculation was straightforward. Canceling would raise questions that available answers could not satisfy without opening the file drawer marked secret. Scientists who argued for urgent measures found themselves sidelined. Drafts raising long-term risks met edits that softened language, moved conclusions to appendices, or delayed circulation. Some analyses arrived at leadership desks revised to align with preferred outcomes. That produced a feedback loop where the next decision leaned on documents already shaped by fear of being the messenger. In that environment, even accurate warnings looked like overreach until outside data made denial untenable. Later, with archives open, a stark detail surfaced. Internal models forecast spikes in thyroid disease from radioiodine exposure within weeks of the accident. Those pages carried stamps limiting distribution. Guidance to affected regions did not include these projections, and countermeasures such as rapid potassium iodine distribution and milk restrictions reached communities late or in inconsistent forms. The difference between what was known and what was shared widened into a public health gap measured in diagnoses rather than headlines. Secrecy did not stop uncertainty. It moved into kitchens, clinics, and schoolyards. People sensed contradiction between calm broadcasts and quiet hospital admissions. Trust thinned. When stronger statements finally appeared, they met an audience trained by days of silence to seek answers elsewhere. That legacy shadowed every later phase, from cleanup quotas to relocation maps, and it set the terms for how the next decisions would be received. The fires no longer dominated the skyline, but the core still smoldered between twisted metal and collapsed concrete. Attention shifted from rescue to containment. Engineers drew up an emergency plan with one aim: cover the wreckage of reactor number 4 fast enough to prevent further collapse and suppress releases from fuel that had melted through floors and pooled in inaccessible chambers. The task demanded a shell large enough to span a building that no longer had reliable walls, and heavy enough to mute radiation in areas where dose rates defeated instruments. Speed mattered as much as strength. Work began under conditions that shaped every decision. Thousands of liquidators rotated through shifts short enough to keep people standing, not necessarily safe. Survey teams walked routes to define work zones, but readings swung widely with height and wind. Designers paired drawings to essentials so fabrication could run while foundation questions were still being asked. Prefabricated steel frames, concrete panels, and shielding blocks moved from rail cars to cranes with minimal delay. The site felt like a moving factory, with assembly lines set up in open air. Radiation dictated methods. Prolonged close work near the ruins was not possible, so crews simplified geometry to favor big pieces and fast placements. Measurements that would normally define anchor points and joint tolerances were estimated from limited vantage points, then adjusted by eye under pressure. Cranes lifted trusses and panels into place from standoff positions, guided by signalers who only had seconds at the edge of high fields. Remote handling tools pushed and nudged components. When those failed, short human interventions bridged the last meter. Precision yielded to throughput. Beneath many sections lay rubble that no team could clear without exceeding dose limits. Concrete slabs sat on warped beams and fragmented masonry. Engineers accepted that the base was uneven and, in places, hollow. They designed supports to straddle voids and transferred loads to what remained of intact columns. Where voids were suspected, they filled cavities with grout and shotcrete, trading ideal foundations for rapid mass that could stabilize loose material. The result was a structure built on destruction rather than on a prepared footing. Progress moved at a speed unusual for a project of this size. In just over 6 months, the shell encased the ruin with a tall western wall, a sloped roof, and a lattice of internal frames that tied fractured sections together. That pace carried a cost. Crews accepted gaps where joints could not be sealed without excessive time in the field. Cracks appeared as concrete cured and contaminated microclimates. Some steel connections missed full torque because tools or hands could not remain in place. The intent was not perfection, but a shield that cut emissions and shed rain and snow. Night work became a tactic. Cooler air reduced equipment overheating near hot zones, and some instruments showed slightly lower external dose rates when ambient temperatures dropped. Concrete poured after sunset flowed better and set without the thermal spikes that stressed formwork and pumps already taxed by contamination controls. The schedule turned the site into a 24-hour cycle. The sarcophagus did its immediate job. Emissions fell, debris stopped moving in the wind, and the risk of large collapses decreased. But the builders understood its limits. It lacked the durability of a conventional containment, the foundation remained uncertain, and water could infiltrate through seams and cracks. The structure paused a crisis rather than resolving it. That pause bought time to monitor the fuel masses buried below, plan future interventions, and design a longer-lived enclosure that would have to work over decades, not months. Once the shell around reactor number 4 cut down immediate emissions, planners faced a different map. Not floors and beams, but villages, forests, and fields. Committees in Kyiv and Moscow reviewed dose surveys, soil samples, and wind records, then drew a boundary that could be enforced quickly. The line settled at a 30-kilometer radius, a circle wide enough to capture most early deposition zones and simple enough for soldiers to explain at a doorstep. The name followed soon after, the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, turning ordinary countryside into restricted territory with a single decree. Evacuations restarted in waves. Convoys moved along fixed routes, and officers carried printed notices that listed a family's address, head count, and the bus stop assigned to their street. Residents received hours, and sometimes only minutes, to gather documents, medicine, and warm clothing. Barn doors stayed unlatched, radio sets hummed on kitchen tables, and food cooled where it had been served. Livestock remained in pens. Volunteer drivers ferried elderly neighbors to assembly points where lists were checked against apartment rolls and village registers. The process looked orderly because it had to be. Hesitation could strand entire hamlets inside a boundary that would harden within days. The circle on paper did not match the patchwork revealed by instruments. Deposition varied by wind shear and rainfall, so some high-dose tracts lay beyond the 30-kilometer arc, while cleaner fields fell inside it. Administrators prioritized a uniform perimeter that could be guarded and communicated, then added fingers of restricted land along roads and rivers where readings demanded it. That compromise produced enclaves, a cluster of homes under ban across a county line. A school closed while a neighboring farm stayed open. Residents asked for explanations the maps could not give in a sentence. Security infrastructure rose quickly. Checkpoints appeared at highway junctions with soldiers recording names, cleaning vehicle tires, and inspecting trunks for produce, firewood, or scrap that might carry contamination outward. Fences traced sections of woodland and cut through meadows, with warning signs posted in multiple languages. Patrols walked riverbanks to intercept fishing and foraging. Work permits, research badges, and day passes defined who could enter and for how long. Even postal routes changed. Parcels from inside the zone required inspection or were rejected outright. Burial teams followed the evacuation. Entire villages judged irrecoverable were leveled by bulldozer. Crews flattened houses into cellars, then mounded soil over the sites to pin contaminated material beneath clay caps. Orchard rows vanished under fill. Street grids that had organized daily life became faint lines under grass within a season. Records noted the locations, but many names disappeared from new editions of maps, and roadsides came down to discourage casual return. The zone reshaped daily logistics far beyond its fence lines. Rail schedules shifted to bypass restricted sidings. Milk collection routes rerouted around farms flagged by inspectors. Schools and reception towns absorbed children by the busload, adjusting class sizes and meal plans with little notice. Medical teams tracked relocated residents for thyroid exams and blood tests, while agricultural planners negotiated feed supplies to replace pasture lost inside the boundary. Declaring the zone marked a blunt acknowledgement. Some land would not return to routine cycles in a season or a year. Forest litter, wetlands, and peat bogs held contamination differently than pavement and plowed soil, and those reservoirs would release it slowly with fire, flood, and decay. Evacuation could move people, but it could not reset those processes. The circle on the map became a long-term laboratory and a barrier at the same time, fixing a new relationship between the reactor's ruins and the region that surrounded them. With streets emptied and checkpoints up, the landscape began to tell the story people were no longer around to witness. Dust settled where footsteps had stopped. Radioactive particles fell with dew, mixed with rain, and worked their way into the ground. In fields and forests, on riverbanks and rooftops, contamination anchored itself in place. Unlike smoke, it did not drift away. It bound to minerals, clung to surfaces, and entered living tissue. The environment became a ledger, recording dose and time in its own slow handwriting. Closest to the blast, the damage appeared first in the pines. Needles browned almost overnight, not from heat, but from cells failing as radiation disrupted their internal chemistry. Branches drooped and then stiffened, leaving whole stands tinted a deep rust. This zone would gain a name later, but in those first days, it was simply a forest that had stopped doing what forests do. No new growth, no insects humming, only silence under a copper canopy that stretched across the western side of the plant. Water carried what the wind missed. Fallout washed off rooftops and roads into gutters, then into ditches and streams, finally joining the river system that threaded through the region. Heavier particles sank and locked into mud, where they mixed with organic matter and stayed. Lighter isotopes moved farther, pausing in eddies and floodplains before settling again. Groundwater did not escape. Infiltration moved contaminants downward, where they met porous layers and lingered, creating pockets of exposure far from any obvious source. Soils responded unevenly. Clay-rich patches acted like traps, holding cesium and strontium tightly on their charged surfaces. Sandy soils let them migrate more easily, carrying contamination deeper or letting it slip into drainage lines. Farmers beyond the cordon saw the effects as rules rather than explanations. Some plots taken out of use, others allowed but with strict limits on what could be grown and where it could be shipped. Grain silos were emptied and burned, milk was dumped, and orchards entered long fallow. Vegetation did not simply absorb the isotopes once and stop. Trees took them up with water, stored them in wood and leaves, and then returned them to the ground each autumn. Leaf litter became a seasonal delivery system. Mushrooms, with their efficient uptake of elements, concentrated contamination in ways that made forests risky in quiet, ordinary ways, gathering berries, cutting firewood, harvesting game. The cycle repeated with every thaw, every rain, every spring flush. Inside trunks, the damage wrote itself in slow circles. Tree rings widened and narrowed out of rhythm, and cells twisted from normal alignment. Under a microscope, the wood showed disruptions that matched known dose patterns, turning stands of trees into a timeline that scientists could read years later. The forest kept the record not as a monument, but as an altered biology, growth that encoded exposure. Across the wider region, fields that looked untouched carried residues in their upper few centimeters, enough to enter crops and pasture. Herds grazed, contamination moved from grass to milk to people. Sediments stored what rivers had gathered, then released traces back during floods, reworking shorelines and wetlands. With human routines halted, the land's own systems took over the job of moving material around, slowly and relentlessly. By then, the disaster existed as much below ground as above. Contamination embedded in soil profiles, sunk into sediments, and lodged in plant tissue that would outlast the decisions made at roadblocks. The landscape held on to the event, and with each season's turnover, it continued to pass that memory along. When people withdrew, the noise stopped first. Roads fell quiet, fields went uncut, and fences sagged. What followed looked like recovery, but it was mainly vacancy doing the work. Plants spread through open lots, saplings took hold in ditches, and abandoned sheds became dens and nesting sites. With tractors gone and gunshots absent, wildlife crossed into spaces that had been off limits for decades. The shift did not come as a surge. It built slowly with each season that passed without plowing, logging, or traffic. Over time, the zone reorganized itself around the one constant that remained. There were no people. Villages softened into tree lines, and courtyards turned into thickets. Orchard rows blurred as shrubs filled gaps, and footpaths disappeared under grasses that grew taller than a person's waist by late summer. Drainage canals clogged and created wetlands that did not exist on old maps. These new edges and water bodies offered cover and food, favoring species that moved quietly and could use a mixed mosaic of forest and open ground. Bridges and corridors once meant for buses became routes for animals to move between riverbanks and forest stands without interruption. The scatter of buildings gave perches, roosts, and winter shelter, and the old garden plots now carried wild seed banks. Large mammals made the most visible return. Deer and elk browsed young growth along road verges where crews no longer trimmed back saplings. Boar rooted through farmyards for buried grain and turned up earthworms in the re-wet fields. Where prey grew more abundant, wolves followed. Later counts found that predators held territories inside the zone that exceeded numbers outside, where hunting pressure and roads kept them scarce. The lack of human disturbance, more than any change in the soil, set the conditions for these population shifts. Packs raised pups in barns and storage sheds, and tracks cut straight lines across courtyards that were once swept clean. Not every arrival was spontaneous. European bison were brought in as a trial, then settled into forest clearings and river meadows, using old fields as grazing lawns. Przewalski's horses, also introduced, roamed power line corridors and sandy terraces, stripping bark in winter and finding mineral-rich soils on river bluffs. Their presence confirmed that a large herbivore could occupy the zone's mixed habitats with little intervention once released. The animals learned the road grid, but had few reasons to leave it. Radiation did not vanish from the question. Birds in some hotspots showed higher rates of cataracts and lower clutch success. Small mammals in certain patches displayed elevated mutation loads and shorter lifespans. These signals did not appear evenly. A clean ditch could sit next to a contaminated thicket, and outcomes changed with microhabitat and season. Scavengers concentrated exposure when they fed on carcasses from dirtier areas, while species that moved widely averaged their doses across cleaner ground. Years after the sirens stopped, the impact surfaced in slower ways. Clinics began to keep thicker files. Cancer registries added columns for place of birth, year of exposure, and distance from the plant. Families told doctors about sore throats that never quite healed, fatigue that did not match the season, and children who needed checkups more often than their classmates. Instead of a surge, the record grew line by line. and patterns emerged from paperwork rather than headlines. This is how the disaster reappeared, through data that accumulated across towns and decades. The earliest clear warning came from children. In contaminated districts, doctors recorded a sharp rise in thyroid tumors, especially among those who had been very young in the spring of 1986. The link traced back to radioactive iodine that settled on pastures and then moved into milk. Many households drank it fresh, unboiled, and without delay, because that was normal practice. The thyroid, which needs iodine, took in the radioactive form as if it were ordinary nutrition. Years later, screenings began finding nodules that required surgery and lifelong hormone treatment. Unlike the first responders' injuries, these illnesses developed with a delay that made cause and effect harder to see. A child exposed in kindergarten might not show symptoms until university. That lag complicated everything: when to screen, how to measure dose history, and what resources to assign to communities that have already moved on in daily life. Some cases clustered in places with heavy fallout. Others appeared in towns that thought they had been spared. Time blurred the map. Health systems struggled to keep up. Specialized oncology units were scarce, and rural clinics lacked trained staff and equipment for early detection. Screening campaigns rolled out unevenly, often depending on local initiative or limited funds. Some regions offered ultrasound exams in schools. Others relied on families to travel long distances for appointments. After years of vague statements and downplayed risks, many parents distrusted official reassurances. They asked for second opinions, kept private logs of symptoms, and formed informal networks to share information about doctors and medicines. International teams tried to quantify the burden. Collaborations with organizations like the World Health Organization set up cohorts, tracked incidence rates, and compared them with baseline populations. Their reports faced pushback from several directions. Statisticians urged caution about small sample sizes and confounding factors. Residents countered with lived experience, braves, prescriptions, and scars that did not fit neat models. Between spreadsheets and personal histories lay a difficult space where numbers felt both necessary and insufficient. Long-term monitoring revealed another unsettling detail. Some people exposed as children showed no issues for decades, then developed aggressive diseases in adulthood. Routine checkups remained normal until they did not. This pattern reinforced a key point about radiation biology. Damage can sit quietly in tissues and only manifest when later life stages, stress, or additional exposures tip the balance. That uncertainty shaped how families planned careers, pregnancies, and where to live. Other conditions appeared in research with mixed strength: cardiovascular changes, cataracts beyond typical age ranges, and immune dysfunction in subsets of the exposed. The certainty varied, but the clinical workload did not. Doctors managed follow-up visits, medication adherence, and recurring scans, all while tracking historical exposure that patients could rarely document fully. Even medical records moved with people as borders shifted and towns were resettled, adding gaps to already incomplete histories. By then, the event had become generational. Children grew up, had children of their own, and brought them for exams that referenced a year the parents barely remembered. The reactor was quiet, but the calendar was not. Each new entry in the registry extended the timeline, showing that the health consequences did not end with the fire. They continued through ordinary appointments, test results, and waiting rooms that never stayed empty for long. Fear traveled with the evacuees. It showed up in small habits first: washing hands more often, throwing out garden produce, keeping windows shut even in summer. Ordinary routines no longer felt safe because the cues people used to judge risk had failed them. The collapse of trust was its own injury. When official messages shifted week to week, uncertainty settled into daily life. People monitored weather reports not for rain, but for what rain might carry. They learned new vocabularies: dose, isotope, screening, then realized those words offered little comfort when doctors could not agree on thresholds or timelines. Relocation added a different strain. Families arrived in new neighborhoods with papers that marked them as exposed. Some landlords hesitated to rent to them. Employers asked quiet questions and slowed hiring. Children entered classrooms where the label Chernobyl followed them down hallways, and parents saw teachers seat their kids near windows or suggest home study during cold season. The identity of victim stuck, even when people wanted ordinary instructions. It shaped friendships, marriages, and whether a person admitted their hometown on forms or in conversation. Conflicting guidance kept anxiety high. One clinic advised avoiding certain foods. Another clinic in the next district said the same foods were fine. Parents tried to track milk sources, water filters, and soil test results, then compared notes at bus stops. When family members developed symptoms that did not fit a simple pattern, headaches, skin rashes, heart palpitations, the gap between reassurance and experience widened. Many turned to home remedies or unregulated supplements, not out of superstition, but because they felt abandoned between policies that changed and specialists who were overbooked. Doctors reported more cases of depression, chronic stress, and disorders without clear organic causes. Waiting rooms filled with people who could not sleep, who avoided crowds, or who checked their bodies for signs of illness several times a day. Relocation disrupted work histories. Unemployment and short-term jobs made treatment harder to afford and harder to schedule. Stigma amplified symptoms. A joke in a factory break room, a whisper on a bus, a nurse's casual remark about radioactive families. Each one added weight to symptoms that already felt heavy. Children absorbed this atmosphere even if they never stepped in the exclusion zone. They grew up with dosimeters on shelves and medical folders that traveled to every new apartment. They heard warnings about rain, mushrooms, and dust on shoes. School health checks became rites of passage. Many learned to plan their futures around the possibility of illness, choosing jobs with health coverage, delaying pregnancy, or moving back to support aging parents who never found steady footing again. Fear passed down like an heirloom, not a story told once, but a practice repeated daily. In surveys and clinical studies, rates of anxiety and depressive disorders in exposed communities often outpace physical diagnoses that could be directly attributed to dose. That finding surprised policymakers who expected the medical burden to hinge on biological injury alone. The reality proved broader. People's sense of control eroded, and with it, their willingness to trust institutions that managed water, food, and care. Communities learned to rely on informal networks, which helped in the short term, but also hardened suspicion of outside guidance. They returned quietly. Some came on foot at dawn, carrying a sack of tools and a photograph tucked into a coat. Others arrived on carts behind old tractors, waved through by guards who knew they were coming back anyway. The official line hardened, warnings multiplied, and yet a small group moved against the flow, toward villages printed with new symbols on maps. They unlocked doors that no longer fit the frames, swept floors buried under plastered dust, and went to work making rooms livable before the first frost. Most were elderly. They had harvested hay from the same meadows since childhood, knew which wells ran coldest in July, and could name the owners of every fence post along the lane. Displacement stripped those anchors away. Apartments on city outskirts offered heat, clinics, and steady bus lines, but not the rhythms that made sense to people who farmed by season, not schedule. For them, the risk they could not see felt less immediate than the certainty of dying far from their kitchens, orchards, and graves of family members they visited by habit. Homes inside the cordon were far from whole. Roofs leaked, stoves rusted, and glass was missing from frames. Returnees patched shingles with salvaged tin, mortared chimneys back into service, and sealed windows with plastic until they could barter for panes. Wells drew water that officials marked as unsafe, but filters, boiling, and long-settled practice stood in for formal guidance. Gardens were tilled and planted in strips, often on the higher ground where runoff moved slowly. Chickens returned to coops built from dismantled sheds. Pigs and goats came later, if at all. Authorities knew they were there. Patrols counted heads, but rarely forced departures after the early years. The calculation was simple. Moving a fragile, aging person again would likely shorten their life more than allowing them to stay. So the state watched informally. Doctors made occasional visits, dosimeters appeared on tables, and notebooks recorded measurements that few residents read closely. Food aid arrived before winter in some villages, as much to track residents as to help them. Daily routines settled around improvised rules. People avoided certain forests where mushrooms grew too hot, skipped berry picking after late summer storms, and culled potatoes from plots that produced bitter taste in dry years. When neighbors shared milk or meat, they marked the source and the season in pencil on jars. Some households kept 2 gardens, one for sale to traders from outside, one for their own use, where they could test new seed or soil without risking a larger batch. Advice circulated by word of mouth, refined by trial rather than laboratory charts. Longevity emerged as a talking point. A few of the returnees lived into their 80s and 90s, outlasting friends who stayed in high-rise blocks near regional centers. Locals pointed to that contrast not to deny radiation risks, but to underline how stress, isolation, and loss of purpose can break a person faster than a measured dose. Work mattered. Chopping wood, tending bees, mending fences, and checking traps kept the body moving and the mind set on the next task. Their presence complicated the narrative of an empty zone. A place labeled uninhabitable still held smoke from cooking fires at dusk. The choice to remain or come back relied on attachments that no policy could erase, a kind of logic built out of memory, routine, and the need to end where life had been lived. The emergency phase ended on paper, but the bills kept arriving. Agencies redirected budgets away from roads and schools to fund decontamination teams, haul contaminated soil, and fence off zones that needed guards year-round. The meter never stopped. Fuel for trucks, maintenance for dosimeters, protective clothing, and hazard pay turned into monthly obligations. As relocation shifted from temporary to permanent, governments financed transport, stipends, and new addresses for people who would not return. The timeline stretched, and with it, the cost column. Money moved in many directions at once. Crews scraped topsoil and packed it into lined trenches. Engineers washed buildings and culverts with high-pressure systems, then carted away sludge that could not be dumped with ordinary waste. Monitoring posts went up along rivers and highways, each with staff, power, and calibration needs. Medical budgets expanded to cover screenings, specialist referrals, and long-term prescriptions. None of these spending lines closed after a year or two. They stacked into a routine that remained, even as headlines faded. The shock to the wider economy hit next. Farmland was withdrawn from use across scattered districts, sometimes based on soil chemistry that did not match district borders. Grain contracts were canceled. Dairy routes were redrawn, and processors installed testing stations that slowed deliveries and rejected whole batches when readings spiked. Timber harvests stalled where wood retained radionuclides, and sawmills lost supply they had counted on for years. Power planning changed as well. Units scheduled to replace older plants faced new safety audits, design modifications, and delays that raised capital costs while electricity demand kept growing. Housing programs grew quickly and unevenly. To move evacuees out of hotels and hostels, planners ordered new apartment blocks on short timelines. Contractors cut corners to meet dates. Thin walls, faulty insulation, and rushed plumbing soon demanded expensive repairs. Elevators needed service before buildings were fully occupied. Street grids went in without drainage, so spring thaws ate pavement and flooded basements. What started as an emergency build morphed into a maintenance liability that local governments had to sustain long after the ribbon cuttings. Cleanup turned permanent. Contaminated machinery could not return to normal duty, so yards filled with idle trucks, cranes, and fire engines that needed storage and security. Soil and building debris went to engineered repositories with liners, leachate systems, and guards. Each site required inspections and repairs after storms. Protective gear expired on a schedule and had to be replaced whether used or not. Insurance schemes did not cover this category of risk, so the state paid and kept paying. A quiet comparison hung over the ledgers. Some annual expenses tied to surveillance, storage, and structural stabilization exceeded what the power station had produced in value during a typical year of operation. What once fed the grid now pulled funds from it, a reversal that shaped how ministries set priorities and how local councils argued over basic services. It also influenced credit. Lenders priced future projects with added risk, and interest rates reflected a lesson paid for in decontamination and concrete. By the time budgets adjusted, the disaster had a line in nearly every department. Education funded curricula on radiation safety. Agriculture ran soil labs. Health expanded registries. Interior ministries guarded restricted roads and warehouse gates. The event imprinted itself on balance sheets as firmly as on maps, a recurring cost that lived in payrolls, repairs, and monitoring logs, and that every new fiscal year had to reckon with before anything else was planned. Pressure built with every budget meeting and every new diagnosis. Engineers faced questions that could not be answered with a quick fix or a new coat of paint. The problem ran deeper than one building. It lived in how reactors behaved under stress, how teams made decisions, and how supervisors reacted when alarms challenged production targets. That recognition pushed reform from the edge of the plant to the center of the industry. It meant changing habits as much as hardware, and doing both under the scrutiny of a world suddenly paying attention. Investigations mapped the failure chain. The reactor's design permitted unstable conditions at low power, while control rods and shutdown logic introduced risks that operators did not fully understand. Procedures encouraged rigid adherence to plans, even as conditions on the control panels argued for a halt. Training emphasized obedience, not intervention. Managers expected schedules to hold and warnings to fit within those schedules. When the accident unfolded, each weakness amplified the next. The takeaway was not a single culprit, but a system that made the wrong action likely and the right action hard to reach. Reforms began with the machines. Emergency shutdown systems were reworked to remove dangerous rod tips and speed insertion. Interlocks and automatic trips were added or recalibrated so operators could not push a reactor into unsafe corners without multiple barriers resisting them. Operating rules were rewritten to limit experiments that placed units in unstable regimes. Plants installed reliable instrumentation to provide clear readings during transients, and maintenance programs shifted from calendar-based checklists to condition monitoring that flagged problems early. Design reviews reached across units of the same type, so known hazards could be corrected everywhere, not just at the site under inspection. Reforms also targeted people and process. Training centers expanded simulator time, exposing crews to rare events and messy sequences instead of scripted drills. Briefings before shifts began to include explicit stop rules, giving any team member the authority to call a halt. Incident reporting systems accepted anonymous submissions, and managers were evaluated on how they handled bad news, not on how they avoided it. Audits tested culture as well as compliance, asking whether staff could challenge a directive without risking their career. The metric shifted from output delivered to risk reduced. Across borders, former rivals opened archives. Technical bulletins that once carried security markings became joint reference material. Specialists compared failure modes, emergency procedures, and near-miss reports. Peer reviews sent international teams into control rooms and maintenance bays to read logs, watch drills, and interview staff. Recommendations came with timelines, and follow-up visits checked whether the fixes worked or had merely been filed. The International Atomic Energy Agency expanded its safety conventions, standardized reporting formats, and built a framework for shared learning that treated transparency as a core defense. Control rooms changed shape. Panels shed clutter, alarms prioritized by importance replaced noisy cascades, and display layouts mapped directly to how operators diagnosed faults under pressure. Human factors experts joined design teams to test legibility, cognitive load, and fatigue. Chairs, lighting, and line-of-sight angles became part of safety, not afterthoughts. The principle was simple: design for the person making the decision at 3 a.m. with incomplete information and seconds to act. These reforms did not undo losses, but they altered the trajectory. The lessons moved from reports into hardware, policy, and habit. Plants updated, crews retrained, and regulators adopted a language that put questioning attitude, defense in depth, and continuous improvement at the core of the field. The next steps extended to emergency planning around sites, evacuation routes mapped, iodine stockpiles tracked, and cross-border drills run on fixed calendars rather than promises. By the late 1990s, Inspectors could see daylight through joints in the old shell. Wind drove snow and rain into the wreck, corrosion spread, and radiation monitors picked up intermittent spikes around the site. The hurried cover that once cut emissions no longer matched the task. Engineers began to model scenarios not for the next winter, but for the next century. What if a wall failed? What if the roof sagged further? What if a tremor or storm tore loose panels and exposed the core debris again? The conclusion was blunt. The first enclosure had bought time, and that time was running out. A replacement needed to do more than cap a hole. It had to survive weather loads, temperature swings, and the chemistry of a building filled with irradiated dust and unstable concrete. It also had to let crews work inside without adding exposure. The concept that emerged was the new safe confinement, a steel arch large enough to cover the entire ruin and the crumbling sarcophagus, with sealed ends and ventilation that filtered the air before release. The structure's job was as much to control conditions as to block them. To limit dose, builders assembled the arch in a clean zone, a short distance west of the reactor. Fabrication happened in modules that could be tested, inspected, and lifted with minimal time spent near contaminated ground. Crews bolted and welded the segments at full scale, installed cladding and seals, and checked tolerances while cranes, lifts, and power tools operated in monitored areas. When the halves were ready, they were joined on site, creating a single span that rested on rails and slide shoes engineered to carry thousands of tons smoothly. Moving the arch into place required a slow, controlled push. Hydraulic jacks advanced it centimeters at a time, over days, across a prepared track bed that crossed the old industrial yard. As the curve of steel crept forward, teams verified clearances around existing towers, ducts, and fragments of the original shelter. Each pause allowed surveyors to confirm alignment and adjust bearing loads. The move ended with the arch seated on concrete foundations anchored deep into stable ground, a fixed frame capable of resisting wind gusts and snow loads that had doomed the first cover. When finished, the new safe confinement ranked as the largest movable land-based structure ever constructed. Its height cleared space for cranes to operate above the wreckage, and its length spanned the entire footprint of the damaged unit with room to stage equipment inside. The scale served a purpose beyond records. It created an indoor worksite that isolated the remains from weather and prevented further degradation from freeze-thaw cycles, leaks, and animal intrusion. Funding and oversight reflected the project's scope. Under the coordination of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, dozens of countries contributed to a dedicated fund, tying disbursements to milestones that independent reviewers verified on site. Contracts bundled design, fabrication, and installation responsibilities so that engineering choices aligned with safety goals, maintenance plans, and long-term monitoring. The outcome depended as much on governance as on welding. Inside the arch, remote systems now do the dangerous work. Overhead cranes travel on gantries, carrying tools to cut, lift, and package unstable elements of the old shelter and reactor debris. Cameras, sensors, and filtration units form a closed loop: see, grip, contain, and remove, with air drawn through filters before venting. This setup lets crews manage risk by distance and shield, not by accepting exposure. It also creates a path to gradually dismantle the most fragile sections, rather than waiting for gravity to decide. Containment reduced risk, but it did not end it. What remains now moves slowly, guided by soil chemistry, water flow, and the ordinary cycles of seasons. The accident's legacy persists not as a single threat, but as a set of processes that keep reworking material laid down decades ago. The tempo is quiet. The effects accumulate in sediments, tree roots, and low clouds of dust when the wind turns dry. This is the stage where management replaces emergency, and the calendar matters as much as the map. Long-lived isotopes anchor that timeline. Cesium-137 and strontium-90 sit in the top layers of soil and river mud, bonding to clay particles and organic matter. Plants take them up with potassium and calcium, then pass them to herbivores, and onward into predators and scavengers. Mushrooms and wild boar show higher levels because their food sources concentrate the same elements. Half-lives measured in decades mean the decline is slow enough to span entire careers, so monitoring programs operate like permanent public utilities rather than temporary studies. Weather keeps the system active. Spring thaws release trapped particles from frozen ground. Heavy rains scour road edges and carry silt into drainage channels and floodplains. In dry summers, leaf litter and topsoil can lift into the air as dust, spreading contamination a short distance, but enough to raise local readings for days. Forest fires matter most. When pines and peatlands burn, they re-emit radionuclides locked in wood and soil, sending plumes that tracking stations follow in real time. Peaks pass, but the reminder is clear. Contamination responds to climate and land use, not just to time. Rivers carry that variability downstream. The Dnieper remains the focus because it links the zone to reservoirs and cities that rely on it for drinking water and irrigation. Gauges and automatic samplers check suspended sediments, dissolved ions, and seasonal pulses from tributaries. Dams and wetlands act as partial filters, trapping a share of fine particles until the next flood rearranges them. Water managers now treat routine tasks, dredging, bank repairs, reservoir drawdowns, as operations with radiological plans attached, so a simple fix upstream does not become a problem downstream. Inside the damaged unit, the challenge is different. Fuel-containing materials, glass-like lava flows, and dust-rich concretes continue to age. Moisture, temperature shifts, and slow chemical reactions change their strength and shape. Some masses shed fine particles. Others form surface salts that can break off and move with air currents inside the enclosure. Engineers model these changes with imperfect data, revise stabilization plans, and schedule work around what can be measured rather than what would be ideal. The question is not only how to remove hazards, but how to predict their behavior years ahead. On the ground, the pattern is patchy. A roadside verge can read lower than a nearby grove that looks identical. A meadow safe after rain can spike after a grass fire or a long drought. Teams update radiation maps repeatedly because local conditions keep shifting. Field crews use handheld sensors and soil cores to refine those maps, flagging hotspots meters wide while leaving adjacent areas open for limited use. The zone teaches a simple rule: treat uniform scenery with caution, because the contamination beneath it is anything but uniform. The work continues at that steady pace. Fences get repaired, sensors recalibrated, and response plans rehearsed for the next fire season. The aim is less about dramatic reductions and more about consistent control year after year, so a past event does not set off a fresh emergency when the weather turns or the river rises. More than an accident, Chernobyl became a slow-moving chapter of human history that is still being written, where science, memory, and responsibility intersect long after the explosion itself faded into the past. If you want to keep exploring stories where history, technology, and consequence collide, subscribe for the next chapter.